Yeah, ready to get going. Mr. Rittenhouse, do you want to put us live? All right, thanks for attending the Board of Education Finance Committee meeting, August 17th at 4:30. And to follow up from some of the items over the last few weeks, maybe if I could set the stage today, it's a little bit of a pause. We're gathering up a lot of the data that we've been studying over the past few weeks in terms of reopening plan, in terms of the action, in terms of our levy, and shifting gears to the opening of school, shifting gears in terms of balancing a budget for this year, and looking forward to next year in terms of what the reopening plan in reality looks like come January, and then what the financial realities are for the district. So a lot of discussion tonight. I really do welcome your questions so that we can begin to dive into the details of our spending, of our budget reductions, of our levy talks, and we begin to advise the whole board. So a quick summary of the agenda tonight. I have an update on House Bill 305. That's the Fair School Funding Plan. Under the district-wide financial information, we have possibly a few reopening plans as it relates to finance updates, federal stimulus funds update. I've updated our spreadsheets. And then we'll end the district-wide financial information with a conversation on levy. And I do want to finish tonight with a unit level analysis, show you a few of the forecast 5 charts that I've been working on, and get your direction for a project, so to speak. Get your direction. We can either look at building or cluster level spending, and I'll show you what we've come up with so far, and then dive down to the building level. And then ultimately, I would like to round out tonight's conversation a little bit with some of the equity, transparency, the racial board. Good evening, Dr. Akbar, just joined for the record. Some of the board policy components, so we can report on those in dashboard form. So does that sound like a plan, Ms. Autry and Dr. Hall? Okay, see some head shaking. All right,
yes,
quick update. Okay, great. Bill 305. So House Bill 305 was born from 2 legislators, Representative Bob Cupp, a Republican from Lima, and Representative John Patterson, a Democrat from Ashtabula. This has been some 3 years ago in its making, and House Bill 305 was the culmination of 8 superintendents and 8 treasurers working over that time frame to develop a comprehensive new school funding formula. And if the board wants to see that detail as the substitute House Bill 305 emerges here in the next month or so, we can get into some additional detail. But the beauty of this formula is it's focused on the classroom. So no longer do we get $6,000 per kiddo, and then it has a state share index applied, and we don't know what the $6,000 gets us across Ohio. In fact, there's no superintendent or no treasurer in the state of Ohio that really understands the formula behind 6,000. There's a couple people in the state of Ohio that have been around for the last 20 or 30 years that understand how we got to those numbers. So House Bill 305 focuses purely on the classroom and funding the teacher and the teacher-student relationship first. And on average, it's about 60% of this funding formula. And then when we look at instructional supports, it's another 15%. And then it rightly frames the conversation for the community and for the legislature about this is exactly what every student needs in terms of a base formula. And then it adds on top of that for special education, transportation, economically disadvantaged. And each one of those areas was partnered between a superintendent and a treasurer over that same time frame to further develop that formula. Now, where it stands right now is substitute House Bill 305 is gaining some momentum amongst legislators, is why I bowed out Friday to talk with Leader Sykes about substitute 305 and getting support for that. It currently sits with the Legislative Service Commission, and we should see some simulations soon. Next week starts an education tour, both in person and virtual, for the 40 new General Assembly freshmen. So if you can think of yourself, we have our board members present tonight who took office in January. There are 40 General Assembly members that are brand new too. And they may have never been exposed to school funding in Ohio, other than maybe hearing the stories of DeRolf. So we have to educate those 40 new members and then get the momentum. There's a lot of momentum now that Cupp is the Speaker of the House, and Patterson's very well respected on both sides of the aisle, to get this over the finish line and out of the House. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done in the Senate. There's some talks of senators issuing a companion bill, which would be fantastic. But as you can imagine, all of this has to happen in the lame duck session of the General Assembly leading up to an election. So it's going to be an upward battle in applying COVID to not being able to be seen, heard, and doing in-person testimony. Very challenging. However, the representatives would say to you that when the state of Ohio had money, it was a more difficult conversation with their colleagues. Now that the state doesn't have money, they're seeing the weaknesses in school funding in Ohio, that there's no formula to apply it to. And here's the perfect example that they have been talking to their colleagues about. In fact, many of us talked over the retreat about this. I know Diana and I have talked about this, and specifically about this, is the need for technology. And we're so very blessed in Akron to be one-to-one, but Columbus Public Schools isn't one-to-one. So the legislature wants to direct monies, which they've done through influencing the different CARES Act pots of money and having competitive writing type things for technology. But wouldn't it have been nice if we would have had a formula to do that for all 612 districts? Or the success and wellness funds that David and I have kind of retroactively applied, like we're doing with CARES Act funds, it is also outside of the formula. So that's why there's so much positive momentum for House Bill 305 or substitute 305. And I'm anxious in getting your input on it. I think there will be times for our board to testify on it. I've tapped Dr. Akbar a little bit because I know he's researching this for his day job. So this could be a pretty quick, all hands on deck response to the legislature to ask for their approval and support of 305. So it would be the most, I'll leave you with this unless there are kind of other questions or updates from David hearing from maybe Ohio 8. It's the most comprehensive review and update of a formula in the past 30 plus years. So this might be the only time to get it done, as Bob Cupp may not be Speaker of the House come January, and the Speaker, the leader of the Senate right now is Larry Obhoff, whose wife is a public school teacher, and there's good momentum that Matt Huffman, who's championed the voucher expansions, is to be president of the Senate come January. There's no better time than right now. Superintendent?
Yeah, I think we're, from an Ohio 8 perspective, waiting to see if there's going to be a companion bill in the Senate, which I think will be the next step in moving this whole process along.
Any questions or details? I wish I had simulations to share with you all. I don't really have simulations yet that's been released from Legislative Service Commission, but any questions?
So what would be the hope that a companion bill would offer to this?
That'll just move it along in the legislative process, because right now it's just in the House, and you have to have a Senate companion bill in order for them to, for the Senate to come, and then they would come together in conference, and if they were successful from conference, then move something on to the governor.
It would allow us to educate the senators if we can get it to committee more quickly. Out of the House's terms of a success would be ideal. Jointly agreed upon or in conference committee before the end of the calendar year would be maybe a lofty goal, because we have a new biennium budget starting July 1st of 2021. So if we have a new school funding formula in law sometime early in 2021, it gives the Department of Education and all the related agencies the opportunity to put all the mechanisms in place so that we can have it starting July 1, which is one of the problems we've had in the past, is getting some traction. We'll lean on the board for their calls and letters and maybe even resolutions in the future to support the Fair School Funding Plan.
Yeah, I think it'd also be a good opportunity. I mean, because I don't know everything, and I know if I don't know, a lot of the families don't know as well. So, figuring out a way to educate them at a level that they understand so that they can help support it too. We need everybody to help us get behind this. Our families, they don't understand, and I know that I'm learning. So.
Yeah, Ms. Autry, that's a really good point. Rep. Patterson had mentioned in our meeting Friday that one of the reasons that we're going to try to reach out to these 40 freshmen is that a lot of folks who are running for office, this would be a perfect venue. So to the extent we can educate our community on that, or educate the state of Ohio, both Republicans and Democrats would want to run on school funding formula, or an equitable school funding formula. So that's I'll bring that up to the committee. Any other questions?
Hey, Ryan. Yes, Derek. Just a couple quick questions. So my recollection of this was that this bill would replace the state share index. Is that correct? With a more sort of modern methodology, which I think the argument would be that it's a more equitable division of funding. First question. Do I have that right?
That's one component of the formula. So if we look at a 30,000 foot perspective of the formula, there's a base cost, then there's the add-ons, and the add-ons are economically disadvantaged, they're special education, they're transportation, they're gifted. Those are the add-ons. And then you take that formula and then you apply a state share index to the 612 districts. What has received the most attention for the biggest overhaul has been the base cost or index. So there is a completely new distribution formula that Representative Cupp, I know, has been asked of this publicly, who was serving on the Supreme Court during the last DeRolf case, says this satisfies the DeRolf case, meaning it's an equitable distribution of resources in a completely new state share index. Yes.
Gotcha. I appreciate that. Yeah, because it seemed like, whether it was implicit or stated explicitly, I don't recall the language exactly, but it seemed like there was language in there that so now would be changes to make it a bit more equitable, but that it would direct further study into determining the actual true cost of educating students from economically disadvantaged districts.
Exactly. Yes, one of the requests that we put into the bill was that there would be a comprehensive study on economically disadvantaged, and there would be a comprehensive study on special education. There has not been a recent study on either one of those in years. And so one of the stories that has been told to the General Assembly is that of equitable distribution of resources. And it was very interesting as Akron in that story was learning about Southeastern Ohio and Appalachia, where we have access to technology here, where that's their number one issue is the access to technology in their homes. They have it to school buildings, but not in their homes. And so there needs to be a comprehensive study on at least those two items so that we can determine what every student needs in all 612 districts. But we do have some placeholder amounts that are more research-based for how to bolster those components of the formula.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other questions on House Bill 305? Okay. Next on the agenda is the reopening plans, and I'll combine that with the federal stimulus funds update. I'm going to present my screen to you and review some of the costs. Hold on a second. Entire screen. Does everybody see the spreadsheet there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So over the last few weeks, in the last finance committee and in the board meetings, we talked about our deficit. Of course, you're familiar with the forecast that we've adopted, or at least updated, that has the about $15 million deficit. And the decision to return to school virtually allows us to defray some cost for sure. Also operating, and this is a big assumption, I want to make a note of this for the board, because I do believe that we're going to have to take some action on this. Much like what happened after March and the employment of our hourly and part-time, the employment of some of our non-certificated staff who otherwise are not driving buses. We assigned them work. We passed a resolution. And I know we're all heading into the direction that COVID is a temporary stay to those expenses, meaning in a true financial crisis that's longer than COVID, we might be taking some other actions. But we are going to need some authority from the board to employ people much in a similar fashion as what we did in March. So I want to pause there, give you an opportunity to respond to that, because that has been our general conversation with the superintendent and I, board, and other committees, as we're thinking that if I'm making assumptions as a treasurer, and again, this is just me making assumptions with you right now, if we're in a virtual environment till January, and some of those cost savings items are on your sheet right now, what does that do to staffing? Well, the disruption, the intent of the CARES Act, and the expectation that certain employees are kept whole during this time needs to be one of those things that we need to support publicly. So I want to pause there and get your response to that, maybe the superintendent's, so that we can prepare for potential action in the next few weeks. I can't see anybody's face here because I'm presenting, but
I just know during the last iteration of this in the spring, there were some employees that we kept on payroll.
Yeah, I guess, Ryan, I guess we need to talk with. I guess we need to talk with a little more specificity. Like, as sort of, I know that you gave some examples, but we might need to go line by line. Kind of so that way we have a better understanding as to sort of, or whether you want to go by classification, or go line by line. So that way we have a better understanding as to sort of who we're talking about, costs associated with that. And sort of, which classifications does it make sense to have a meaningful conversation as it relates to keeping them whole, as we did in the spring. So that's why I didn't say anything, because I was going to wait for you to keep talking. So yeah. I mean, I can't say I know enough yet to intelligently opine.
I think what it's probably best for me to do is recycle the resolution from March and April, and after this meeting I'll send out those classifications and who are impacted. I think that's probably the best way to do it. I did survey our colleagues. I'm going to leave it as our colleagues because it's not a public survey, but some of our colleagues in the Big 8 are treating this as a temporary disruption, and they are keeping those classifications of employees. And again, to your point, Dr. Hall, I'm talking generally at this point. They are keeping those employees whole. Yeah,
and Ryan, I was going to say too. I mean, as far as you mentioned that there are some cost savings that that are going to happen because we've made the decision to go online. Only that was not why we chose to go online, obviously. As we've stated publicly, which is why I'm stating it publicly again, factor in it all. But I guess the question becomes then, what amount of those saved dollars would go to keeping people sort of whole, and what would go towards trying to address what we expect to be that $15 million shortfall for this year. So that's kind of my mind, how I kind of simplify it. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Am I thinking about that the right way, or is there a different way I should be thinking about it?
The way I have been approaching it over the last few meetings has been, can we achieve the $15 million without impacting staff? Using the budget items that are on your list now that are approaching about $8 million, and the outline of the one-time type transfers, as well as being smart about the use of CARES Act money, can we reach the $15 million? And I believe, yes, we can. Now that I go back to the assumptions and the disclosures are written in fine print here, but that's assuming there's not another spike of COVID, it doesn't shut down, there's not further cuts from the state of Ohio. What I do know is, I think I mentioned this in the retreat, is I'm very comfortable with the numbers that are listed on my screen today. I'm very comfortable that we can achieve that $15 million. What I'm less sure of is a blended environment starting in January. It will most definitely need additional resources. So it's almost, if we want to look at it, it almost has to be more than $15 million, or obviously we're going to be very smart about the use of CARES Act money. But in terms of priorities, Dr. Hall, that's how I've prioritized, at least how I'm approaching my reporting to you. Obviously, you, with the superintendent's recommendation, makes the decision ultimately about staff, but I will leave you with one other part from my discussion with colleagues last week. Is there's a bit of, I would call it a non-academic disruption analysis going on. And we're starting to put some data and numbers to it. But this non-academic disruption analysis you've heard, right? In typical times of financial crisis, which is unfortunate in Ohio, we've all been through it. Your number one expense is staff. There are usually staff reductions. Now we have federal stimulus dollars that definitely indicate we want you to keep staff employed to the extent possible. Now we're combining that with the end of a levy cycle. But the disruption analysis of, let's say, taking on an MOU to a contract, which I know we loosely pair with furlough type language, might not be worth it for the board, the employee, and the disruption. Because a lot of those essential staff members in a very temporary shutdown like this would go look for gainful employment elsewhere. And it is so very difficult to attract and retain those employees. So that's kind of where, without citing those other large 8 districts, are with the disruption analysis saying no. To the extent that CARES Act will bridge the gap and we can trim the budget in this virtual reopening, that's how we're going to proceed. So I really am throwing out my assumptions and how I navigate so that you can course correct me along the way.
No, I appreciate that, Ryan. The other thing I was thinking of as you were talking as well was, the other reason why I think if we can save more than 15, we should try to do it is because every dollar that we can save above that, means that we're going to be asking for less in the size of a levy as well.
Right.
Because I know that we had talked at a few board meetings ago about sort of what size levy were we looking at potentially having foregone the opportunity to go in November. And I think we were looking at sort of conservatively, like best case scenario, like, 9-10 mils.
Right.
And so, and that's larger than any levy we've ever passed in Akron history, as I recall. So that's an additional sort of incentive to try to save beyond that $15 million. But I think, and I know that we're all on the same page here, but also just want to make sure that we're being thoughtful and sensitive about sort of, I think, Ryan, the analogy you've used before is trying to use a scalpel as opposed to a cleaver or machete. So yeah. So I'm definitely interested in sort of furthering, this part of the conversation.
Any other board members have a question or follow up to that?
I concur. I mean, it makes sense that we start to consider above and beyond that 15 million. It just makes sense.
Agreed.
Okay. So on that topic, I'll report on the classifications that we had in the previous resolution. I think that'd be a great place to start. And as we get closer to the virtual reopening, and maybe even some discussion on Monday night, we can further that conversation. Let me share with you an update of the CARES Act funds. I don't know if I've shared this with you or not, but I will. It's a Google Doc. I know you've seen it in printed form. And if you see on your screen there, about $10.7 million was awarded to APS for the ESSER fund, so the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. And to date, we have about $7.5 million remaining. Of that 7.5, just under $1 million is going to be allocated to non-public schools. I've updated these numbers just to let you know. And again, the priority and values behind those numbers has been just what we outlined. Reduce the drag on general fund, bridge the gap for staff that would otherwise be taken out of general fund, or overtime or additional services necessary to support our community. The second round here is the CRF, of which $1.2 million was awarded. And you can see we have spent and or encumbered the entire amount of that. That's because of the unemployment expense and largely technology. Those expenses either existed or have been expanded due to the need, and we have a whole programmatic list with curriculum instruction about how they have expanded their service and connection to our homes. And so otherwise this $1.1 million would be completely spent out of general fund. And then we have submitted the application for the Broadband Ohio Connectivity Grant. The maximum amount we could submit for was $250,000. And I've shared that with our state representatives. I see a question from Dr. Akbar saying, can we email that out? So I can even do that when we're pausing here. Okay. So I think we have been very good stewards of federal stimulus dollars, very transparent. Our return and reopening finance and grant, I know you got to witness them and their engagement, which I love. And I think we've been very transparent with these funds, but these have to last us a while. So that remaining 7 million, or now what, 6 million, once the non-public school transfer goes into effect, we will have to be very careful about how those funds are used. Is there any questions in regards to what I've presented thus far on that?
Hey, Ryan, I just was thinking, I was trying to think about the report out for the board meeting, that maybe, because I know that there are lay people that sort of, that watch those meetings that probably are not going to follow some of this stuff. Right. And maybe a way of doing it is when we're talking about those different buckets of money. And I tried to talk about it this way at the last board meeting. But I didn't think about, because a lot of the federal fiscal law, you're always thinking about sort of purpose, time, and amount. So what is the purpose for which the money is being spent or can be spent? I.e., the types of items that one can spend the money on, the timing of when those dollars must be spent, or you lose it. So the use it and lose it date, and then what is the amount available in each of those buckets. And so you've done that already, obviously, but I'm saying, but I'm just thinking through as we sort of talk about it, in the board meetings on Mondays, you'll probably hear me start to use that rubric or that way of trying to explain it, is talking about it more through a purpose, time, and amount lens to help make it. And if you want to do that as well, that's fine. But that's how I'll be trying to bracket and or bucket the conversation around the CARES Act funds, because it's hard to keep track of it as a layperson. So
okay, maybe I'll just put those 3 bullet points to the different pots of money in a very simple summary to display.
Yeah.
I'll do that for Monday night's finance update for my report. It's a good idea. Okay, any other questions as it relates to the reopening and federal stimulus dollars and kind of where we're at? And my goal is to keep you posted on I know I'm still sharing this screen to you, but here's where we're at right now. About $8 million of the analogy of scalpel-like budget reductions and or trimming of purchase services of things that we will not need. Obviously, all of the increased need is being shifted to the CARES Act. So I'll give an update on that, and I will continue every couple of weeks to update you on those numbers.
Can I ask just one question?
Please.
About the broadband grant. is that just a one-time thing, or is that something we can reapply for?
It's a one-time grant to be written and secured and used prior to the end of this calendar year.
Okay.
Yeah. There was a talk of making it a matching grant, and that idea was dropped because by the time that districts apply for the grant, by the time they're awarded the grant and receive the money, it's going to be middle of September, and districts are going to have a hard time. How do I say this? Districts like Akron, who have been very proactive ahead of the curve, we already went out and got contracts for our connectivity for our students. So we're ahead of the curve. So technically speaking, those expenses don't qualify for that grant. So we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about how to use those money, like the service contracts on the hotspots for the months of September to December. So we'll use all 250,000, but it's a really tight time frame, and unfortunately, it's not been renewed. Yeah. All right, the next item on our agenda is levy discussion, and I just want to do my part of keeping this in front of us. And Diana Feidel and I will update the resolutions. And I would ask the board, superintendent, about when is that the appropriate time, David, to bring that to the board. I know we're heading and have some momentum to be on the ballot in May, but I also know that putting the stake in the ground and moving forward is obviously of interest too to lots of individuals from our conversations at the retreat and the past few finance committees, so that we can take the appropriate action, fundraise, have the resolutions in place to certify the appropriate millage and those kind of things. So I do want to open it up for comments on that.
Hey, Ryan, this is Derek. I just had a quick question. I mean, and I know this we're maybe a little early on this, but when or how soon will you have more information on realistically sort of what or you know what amount we'd be asking for from a millage standpoint? Like what timeline and what time frame or timeline would you be able to talk with more specificity about what we're going to need to ask for?
I could be ready for some general discussion around some of the millages that we've talked about and what the assumptions are driving them, meaning assuming that we can balance the budget this year. So if we pick up this fiscal year and end with a similar cash balance to what we had this year and achieve that, we could be talking about the exact same millage. So I think to answer your question, I think within the next 2 weeks, I'd feel comfortable doing that. The farther we get into the virtual reopening and the use of this CARES Act money, if I can bridge another $5 or $6 million from January 1st through the rest of June of next year, I'm feeling very confident that the increased personnel expense with maybe substitute teachers, bus drivers, instruction to both balance the online and the in-person, I think we can talk about that soon, Dr. Hall.
Okay. All right. Fantastic.
Superintendent, is there anything on your end in terms of next steps and decisions for Finance Committee in terms of community engagement or strategies, anything that is relevant for our committee?
Yeah, I think as we talked about in the retreat, getting our citizens committee organized with some recommendations from the board on co-chairs, volunteering co-chairs of the campaign and a campaign treasurer, because we'll need to start getting donations in pretty quickly.
when do you think, just a general question to the committee here, when do you think, much like what we did the lead up to the November election, meaning if we pass resolutions that doesn't commit us to a certain millage, when might we want to put the resolutions on to determine for sure May, or is that premature at this point?
Well, I mean, I would love to hear others' thoughts as well on this. But if we're going to go in May, and I think we should. And I tell you, one of the reasons why I think we should go in May is because, and Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we go in May, we don't pass in May, then we can go again in obviously November. But if we go in November, don't pass. Now we're into 2022. And then we're waiting a whole other year to 2023 to get new funds. So I guess, I know that there may be some obstacles, or may be a little more difficult in November as far as getting on. But at least we get 2 bites in the same calendar year. So that way, we can get those new monies flowing by January 2022. Do I have that right? Or
You have that right.
Okay.
And that's a very important point. As boards and educators, the last thing that anyone wants to do is make mid-year budget reductions to programming. It's very disruptive, obviously, to students and families and schools and school buildings. So if there's a May attempt, it allows you to respond before the school year starts.
In my mind, a May levy is almost a given at this point for all those same reasons you just outlined.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions or comments on levy?
Right, Ryan, I'm just jotting down. So basically, so you're thinking in about 2 weeks, we can talk more about what we think we're going to need to ask for.
Yes.
Okay.
Allow me to dust off those detailed reports that I did before on millages. And I want to get them in your hands. To Dr. Akbar's question, it's very hard to present and have people follow along. So I want to get them in your hands with plenty of time to review them prior to the presentation. And I think I know the important part of that discussion will be the assumptions that we're going to make. The assumption that we'll balance the budget and finish the 2021 school year with the approximate same amount of cash as we did this year, if not try to be better. The assumptions that we're gonna return to school in a blended environment in January, and the increased costs associated with that will be covered by CARES Act. So I'll put those assumptions at the very top of that proposal so we all follow along, and then we can get down to the millages. And the millages likely, and unfortunately will probably be the same, meaning about 8.9 mils has been the largest we've ever asked for in the past 20, 30 years. And so we'll have to talk through what the average homeowner would pay. I'll have all of that updated for the next conversation.
So Ryan, in your modeling, are you going to model? Is that going to include staff reductions?
It will not include staff reductions for a May levy.
Okay.
Right, I'm still operating under the assumption that these federal stimulus dollars in this temporary disruption that everyone is facing, and in K-12, that we're heading down the route of passing a similar resolution, keeping our employees whole during this time, keeping them well trained to respond to the COVID realities, I think is a smart investment of our time. And I did write down a note from before, as there are going to be some districts that walk through those furlough type scenarios and navigate memorandums of understanding to their bargaining unit contracts. And maybe I need to run down through a financial scenario for us just to reiterate that the disruption that causes and the very few dollars that it returns, faced with trying to replace those staff members in the future, might not be worth it. Again, I'm not presuming your decision. I'm just saying that disruption may not be to take on that additional risk and then to try to get fully staffed up come January. So when you think about unemployment, if the federal unemployment laws are extended, if it's 400, 600, 200, and I know those talks in Washington have stalled, and we negotiate furlough type language, which means that we'll pay around $20,000 for a family insurance policy and somewhat less than half of that for a single insurance policy. When we get down to it, is a 20 to 30% savings on a salary truly worth the disruption that it would cause in trying to attract and retain people in a short amount of time? And I think I know that's part of the intent of CARES Act funding. So the assumptions, Dr. Hall and the rest of the board members, are so important for us to talk about. They're so important for us to be, these aren't Ryan's assumption or David's assumptions, that these are our collective assumptions. And I know obviously we've done this, and all the districts in Ohio have been doing this regarding our reopening plan.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you. Okay, the last item that I had was just on unit level analysis, that we outlined our discussion topics from Finance Committee from a while back. I would like to get, now that we're getting closer to reopening, at least my office and staff, with the settlement of our bargaining unit contracts and applying retroactive payments and getting closer, and now I believe that my budgetary staff have their feet planted here. I'd like to get back to this unit level analysis. And I'll show you a couple screens in this unit level analysis. Loosely let me present again. All right, is everybody able to see the bar chart?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yes.
And now it's timed out. This unit level analysis, let me back up and hit 5 site. I know I did a little bit of this in the retreat, and it's really hard to follow along. But this left-hand toolbar has charts and operations that we've populated in just about every area of the organization, from spending to comparisons to efficiency to report card to salary data and salary schedules for our bargaining units to staffing, student performance. And so I'd like to show you one chart tonight, and then I would like to seek your opinion, request to kind of pick on a couple buildings and clusters to do this deep dive project. And I know that Dr. Hall and Ms. Autry, we started on this prior to COVID, and I want to go back to that and see what are the parameters and metrics that you want to see, so I can stress test this software in the next few weeks to show you exactly the response and the growth. And so let's just take a look at this chart. This chart is expenses for the district. And I remember very early in our time together in Finance Committee, remember the Finance Committee that I had, the State of Ohio Accounting Software Manual book. You remember how it is very robust. We'll say that, right? And it's a world I know that I live in sometimes all alone, but we can work down through fund and function. So I know one of the conversations we had early on was special education. We should be able to come down to this sub-function and say, what is it that we're spending on special education in the district? And to Dr. Hall's point very early on, it's growing at an exponential rate. Are we receiving the appropriate funds to offset special education? Now, what I like about this software now is we can take special education, and I think if you're okay with it, what I'd like to do for one of the first projects here is take special education and run it down to a cluster and building level. And again, I can't see your faces, so I would appreciate some feedback here.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, Ryan. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. No, that's what I need, because I can't see anything other than my bar chart up here. So, so that's one project that I'd like to do. And we talked in the board retreat a little bit about what are the conversion, the factors, and what I'm interpreting that is, and please correct me, is how do we normalize these results? Meaning, we know that we may have more senior level staff at one building versus another, so that could skew the per pupil expenditures for special education in one building versus another. We may have a very young staff at another, and we looked at some of those things. We have special education units embedded in some of our buildings and not in others. So we do need to normalize that. And so that's the project that I'd like to, and so I'm hearing Dr. Hall say yes. I'd like to do that on special education.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ryan, I think it's the first step. I mean, I know we talked about sort of the equity and the finance, equity and finance. I mean, I think that's the first step towards trying to get there, is really drilling down and doing this kind of work to kind of see, you know, what's our spending trend look like, you know, sort of, you know, by cluster and by school. And then to your point, looking at the reasons why there's differences. So, you know, I one of the terms I frequently use in my day job is, I try never to weaponize data.
Right.
You know, data should be a conversation starter, not a mallet that we're using to hit anybody over the head with.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and so because to your point, you know, just the one example you gave, you know, all else being equal, you know, if I have a more senior staff, of course it's gonna look like I'm spending more money, you know, as compared to a cluster school that's got new staff, and there may be reasons why we have more senior staff or new staff, you know, depending upon which scenario you have in one district or school. So again, it's a conversation starter. And I think that, and the one thing I'm very committed to wanting to pushing through in the next 3 years, is really us to have some sort of equity conversion factor that we've developed, as a district, you know, and so, you know, that is financially sound. You know, that maybe others, that maybe other districts, you know, would want to emulate, or come ask us about. You know, it's right. Kind of goes back to that overall kind of narrative that I know Dr. Akbar and other people have talked about we want to be, you know, setting the tone and you know, and be, you know, basically, you know, market driving as opposed to market driven, as much as possible. So yes, so again, this is me shaking my head very vigorously. Yes. That I loved, and I know Ms. Autry and I have had some conversations. I know, you know, early on with you, Ryan, as well, about looking at this by cluster and by school. And I think special ed is just kind of the tip of the iceberg there too. I mean, I'd also be interested in looking at, you know, Title I expenditures, you know, in different clusters of schools, and wanting to understand sort of how those monies are being spent. You know, and that kind of dovetails into what we talked about before about, you know, having the high school, you know, having the campus high school principals kind of come in and present, you know, to a certain degree as well as sort of what decisions they're making in their buildings about who and what their money gets spent on, and what obstacles or opportunities, you know, they're trying to address with said decision making. So, you know, Anyway, so those are just my kind of initial thoughts.
Yeah, and you said equity, and
Yes.
so I do want to bridge here the latest board initiative in terms of expanding our equity policy, and as it responds to the racism as a public health crisis. Because what we're going to do, I think, in Finance Committee, as we begin these projects and studies, is we'll begin to identify components that we can wrap into our equity dashboard. And so that, to your questions, comments, and I think a lot of the conversation we had the last couple of days in the retreat, those data points, what we want regularly reported on, and that board members can see, and the communities can see live time. The work that we're going to be doing here is utilizing the same software. So I do want to bridge those two. Now, I know it's going to bridge also between a couple different committees, but the Forecast 5 software is extremely robust, and while the dollars and cents of it really isn't, the important part, it's the trend, it's the purposeful nature of where those funds, and to Dr. Hall, I could not agree more. I don't ever want finance to be used as an artificial point or to distract or deter people. Finances are what they are. We don't game finances in Akron Public Schools. We don't game them, and we only use it to advise us. So I do think this is going to be really important work. Okay, so we've got special education, equity and finance, and I want to explore, Dr. Hall, maybe in the future and offline with you about this conversion factor, maybe some proprietary overlay that we do. What other projects? Because I'd like to take on a couple.
I think it would be helpful to see some type of compare and contrast when we're talking about, racial equity, because all of our schools have a different racial makeup. I think it would be helpful, to see the differences between a school that might have a higher, minority population than another, just to educate all of us. That's something that I would like to see.
Ms. Autry also looked at English learners too. And I tried to stress test this software to say, are English learners, what additional resources do they need, right? And what is the financial story behind that? So if it's okay with you, I'm gonna look at racial equity, spending, demographic trends in clusters, and then we'll look at maybe English as a second language too.
Ultimately, I think it would be good if we could disaggregate the data in many ways, but when we're talking about finances and equity, and an equity formula, we want to be able to say that equity formula and then the spending patterns creates greater academic achievement or graduation or student success. It doesn't necessarily mean academic. It could be more students are getting exactly what they need. They're graduating, they're starting businesses, they're having multiple credentials, those type of things. If there's a way in the end we can overlay our spending with student success, I think that would be our ultimate goal and our ultimate story around being a national leader.
Right. Yeah, I like that a lot. In fact, the work that the board's doing on your 3 areas of focus, the spending priorities should be aligned with that. I like that a lot.
And then also, Ryan, too, there was I thought there was some language in the Cut Patterson proposal that I think mentioned that I think there were 3 studies that they were recommending be done over the next couple of years. I think one, Ryan, to your point, was to determine, I think it was determine the appropriate funding levels for English learners, appropriate funding levels for students with disabilities. So I think the language was updating the special education weights that hadn't been updated since 2007, and then looking at sort of the additional cost of sort of educating other disadvantaged students economically as well. But again, I think those were the 3 studies, as I recall, that they were recommending be done. I think, as I remember it, they were saying that those 3 studies would most directly impact the school funding formula conversation.
They would. You're right. You're exactly right. Anything in addition on we titled this section the unit level analysis. Obviously, that title doesn't do it justice, but I think it's kind of good there to set the big picture, and we'll keep the agenda going this way. We'll start with legislation. We'll do some summary reports updating, obviously, for the foreseeable future on CARES, our general fund, and then finish with an update on our projects. And I'll make some good momentum on these projects in the next few weeks. And then I will send out all the attachments tonight of what we looked at and the updated financial amounts, as well as tomorrow or even later tonight, if I can get in and look at the resolution for the classification. Superintendent James on what we passed in terms of resolution can advise us.
Yes.
Okay. That's what I had for tonight's agenda. Anything else from the committee?
Ryan, I just have one last question, and again, I know we're over, but just one last question.
Oh yeah.
Is there any chance that we can play around in the, you were, a couple of times now, you've kind of teased us with those dashboards. Is there a way that we can get a username and password where we can kind of play around and start looking through it ourselves?
Yeah, let me ask them. We have a number of licenses, but I mean, there's no harm that can be done by jumping in there and playing around. They're only pulling data from our databases. It's not pushing data to it. So
right.
I would love to be in person, because there's so many reports that we can go through together. I know that can't happen now. So I would like for you to see that. Let me see what I can do on that.
Well, I was going to say too, and I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I'm happy to do an in-person with you. We can get big enough room. We can social distance and put a mask on. Because I agree with you. I think we've all sat through webinars when people try and demo stuff. They're not fun. So it's it's the most appropriate way I can put it. They're not fun. And so I think those are always better in person if you can kind of get a big enough room where we can get a screen that kind of comes down and you kind of drive and you all kind of sit spaced out and masked up, so we can kind of see and ask questions in real time. So I mean, I'd be happy to do that. I don't want to speak for my other colleagues, but I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
I would be willing to meet in person.
Okay. Yeah, we can get the boardroom or a room on the second floor of the admin building, properly social distance with a couple of us would be great. And your questions will drive the charts, but in the meantime, I'll see if I can give you a password, if the company will give us a demo password or something, you can go in and see all the charts. That'd be great. Okay.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, everyone. And I think that was it. Any other questions, comments?
Yes, sir.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right.